Good morning, dear students. I welcome you to the second demo of object-oriented programming. And I'm going to begin from where I left. So in the last demo, we created this class called point, and we declared two data members of this class, public data members of the class x coordinate and y coordinate. However, defining public data members is discouraged in modern object-oriented programming. Today, the common practice is to make all data members private, which means that clients have no direct access to the internal variables. Clients instead use methods by the class to obtain access to information stored. So keeping implementation details away from the client is likely to improve simplicity, flexibility, and security. And I mentioned the word client. Client means any code that makes use of the class. So in this example, the main method is the client code because it is using the point class. So this code that you see is using the class we defined above. This code is called the client code. The code which creates object and then uses its data members and member functions. And this is called the designer or the implementer of the point. That means the implementation is there, and this code within the main function is basically utilizing that class. So this is the client code. So whenever I use the word client, that means I refer to the code that is making use of the class we define. So making the instance variables private is easy enough. All you have to do is to change the public keyword to private. So I'm going to do that. Private. Now I've declared int x coordinate and y coordinate is private. So these data members are not accessible from outside the body of this class. And the problem with this definition is that the client code, this code, no longer have any way to reach the information of x coordinate and y coordinate because they are private and they are only accessible within the class, and I am using it in the main method, which is the client code. So it makes this class unusable in its current form. The clients need some way to create point objects and to retrieve the individual x and y coordinate from an existing point. So creating object is basically the responsibility of a constructor. A constructor is a special member function of the class which has the same name as the class, and a constructor does not have any return type, and it's called when the object of the class is created. So in other words, it means you cannot call the constructor again for the same object. So once the object is created, you cannot call constructor again for that particular object. But if you want to create another object again, for another object, the constructor will be called at the time of its instantiation. Another important thing to remember is that classes often have more than one version of the constructor to take account of different initialization patterns. In particular, most classes define a constructor that takes no argument, which is called the default constructor. And the default constructor is used to initialize an object declared without specifying a parameter let. So I'm gonna go to this class and create a constructor, and remember that constructor has to be public, so I have declared another access specifier, the colon, and then the name of the class, which is point, and no arguments, and then the body of the constructor. This method is a method because you can see it has the pair of parentheses in front of it, and it has no return type like void, int, float, char, or some other data type, and it can take arguments, but for the moment this constructor has no arguments, and this is called a default constructor. So whenever you create an object from this point class, this code will be executed first. So in order to prove this point, I'm going to just the constructor is called. So now in the man method or function, I've created a point class, a point object, sorry, and that means at this point the compiler will go and call this method, and when it calls this method we should see the constructor is called. But the problem here is that we have declared the x coordinate and y coordinate as private now, and we are directly accessing these data members, so the compiler will generate errors that these are not accessible. And again, to prove this point, let's compile this code and to see if that's the case. And as you can see, point x coordinate is private, point y coordinate is private. So now we have created another problem, and that is if we declare the private data members, we cannot have access to those members, then this class is unusable, right? So what we are going to do, we have to create another constructor which initialize the point object. So when the constructor, as I mentioned, is the function which is called at the time of creating an object, so I'm going to go there and create another constructor. Again, the name of the constructor will be point, and this time it's going to take two arguments. One is the type int and the other is type y, the x coordinate and the y coordinate. And now if I want to create an object, I have to specify two values, right? So the process or the syntax for calling this constructor is to, at the time of creating an object, I'm going to say 10, 20. So our class has two constructors. One is the default constructor, which doesn't take any arguments, and the other is called another constructor which takes two integer arguments. So how does the compiler know which version of the constructor to call? Based on the instantiation or object creation, if you specify two values, the compiler will look for a constructor which takes two arguments and will call that appropriate version of the constructor. So in this case, because I have specified two values, the first argument 10 will be copied into x, and the second argument will be copied into y, and then what I'm going to do is x coordinate equals x, initialize coordinate equals y. So now we have a way of initializing the x coordinate and the y coordinate of the object based on the constructor. And again, the problem is you cannot have direct access to these variables, so I'm going to comment out this code. And now if I compile, but sorry, because we have to remove this also, this line, comment that, and let's try compile this code now. And as you can see, the green line means everything's fine, the code compiled successfully. So just to review what we talked about is that a constructor is a function and it has to be public, otherwise you won't be able to create objects in the client code, because if the constructor is private, then you cannot call the private members of the class outside the body. So we have to make it public. So constructor will always be public. There are special cases like the singleton design pattern where we can have a private constructor, but there are then different ways of creating objects using their methods. I'm not going to go into the details of that. For the time being, just remember that we will always declare constructor as public. So a public constructor, this is the default one because it doesn't take any arguments, and this is a parameterized constructor. It takes two arguments, both of type integers. And when we create an object from the class, we have to put a pair of parentheses and then pass two integers, and the compiler will know which version of the constructor to call. So the first value will be copied into x and the second value will be copied into y, and we will initialize those to the data members. So now we have achieved something called data hiding by declaring the data members of the class as private. It's also called data abstraction, that we hide the details of the data members of an object, and the client code does not need to know how things happen internally. This is called abstraction, and all it has to do is we'll provide a parameterized constructor, and at the time of creating an object, the client has to specify two values. Right, but we have created now another problem, and the problem is, okay, we created a point, we initialize the x and the y coordinate, but now I want to access those x coordinate and y coordinate. So for that, let's discuss something called getters and setters. So in computer science, methods that retrieve the values of data members are formally called accessors, but are more often known as getters. By convention, the name of the getter method begins with the prefix get. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go again, and under the public keyword before the private keyword, I'm going to create a method void set x, and this method is going to take an argument of type integer. This name is a convention that the name of the setter function has to be begin with the set. It's a convention, and then the name of the data members whose value this method is going to set. So I'm going to say x coordinate equals x, and I'll create another one for the y coordinates, void set y and int y, and I'm going to say y coordinate equals y. So I've created two member functions, both of them are public, under the public keyword before the private keyword, and their responsibility is to change the value of the x and the y coordinate. Because the client does not have direct access to this x coordinate and y coordinate, so the client code has to call these methods, pass some values, and change the values of the x and the y coordinate. And we also need a way of getting those information out of the object. For that, we will create something called getters. So I'll say int get x, and then I'll say return x coordinate. And similarly, I'm going to say int get y and return the y coordinate. So this is a complete class now. We have declared two constructors. One is the default constructor, which doesn't take any arguments. The other is the parameterized constructor, which takes two arguments. And we have two setter functions. We call them setter functions. They're also called mutators in some programming languages, to change the values of the x coordinate and the y coordinate. Whenever we want to change their values, we are going to call these set x and set y methods. We have created then two other member functions. We call them getters, and sometimes they are called accessors in some programming languages. So we have now a complete representation of the point. So I'm going to remove everything and just start from scratch. So we'll first create a point called p, and we say the initial values of p is 10 and 20. That means the x coordinate will be initialized with 10 and the y coordinate will be initialized with 20. And then I'm going to say display these values. I'm going to say p dot get x. This is the getter function which returns the value of the x coordinate for this point. And then similarly, I'm going to say p dot get y. And I would always recommend to put spaces after and before the operators, just to make things stand out and easy to read. So now when we execute this program, we should see on screen the value of the x coordinate for this point and the value of the y coordinate for this point. So let me compile the code and to see if it's syntactically correct. Yes, it is. And now run the program. And as you can see, we have the x and the y coordinate point. Now, for example, we later decide we want to change the value of the x coordinate and y coordinate. So for that purpose, we have declared two member functions, and they are set x and set y, and they both take arguments. So if I want to change the value of the x coordinate, I'm going to call set x. If I want to change the value of the y coordinate, I'm going to call set y on the object. So all I have to do is to come ahead and say p dot set x, and I'll pass some value, say this time 100. So the value of the x coordinate will be replaced with 100, not 10. And then again p dot set y, I'm going to say 200. So I've changed the x and the y coordinate for the same point called p. And now if I just copy this code and display it, we should see first 10 and 20, and then we change the values using the mutators or the setters functions, and then we should say 100 and 200. So let's compile and run. And as you can see, we have 10 and 20. This was the first statement, and then we changed its value from 10 to 100 and 20 to 200, and then we again displayed the x coordinate and y coordinate, and we have 100 and 200. Thanks for watching. And just to overview what we did today, the first thing we discussed is the data hiding concept. Data hiding means declaring the data members of the class as private. It's sometimes called data abstraction, and they are declared as private, so no client has direct access or uncontrolled access to these data members. And then we created two constructor, two versions of the constructor, and a constructor is a method which does not have a return type, and the name of the constructor is the same as the class. And this one, which doesn't take any argument, is called default constructor, and this one is called parameterized constructor. So let me just comment this code so that you know. And then we have these setter functions. The return type of the setter will always be voids. So I'm going to say setters. And then the getter functions which return the values of the private data members, so I'll say getters. So dear students, if you have any problem, any confusion, kindly let me know, and then I'm going to answer your questions in the next video. I'll also post the source code of this, and you can then open it in your IDE and execute it. And if you have any problem, let me know. Thanks for watching. See you next time.